Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is another show-stopping performance by the incredible mind of James Williams, author of The Railroad Through Mad 8 Pass. As ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. Why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled Stone Cold Killers. Part 1. Let's get straight into that. David and Marcus Schultz are what you call pickers and run a rather lucrative business simply named D&M's Treasures, though locally it was just called D&M's. They made their living buying and selling things considered junk by most, but have value to collectors or interior decorators. They had strings of good and bad luck, but when it was good, it was really good. Mark always operated on the up and up, sometimes paying more than he should because he felt obligated to give a fair price. His brother David, on the other hand, tended to be underhanded and cheap. On a tip from a fellow picker, they turned onto a dirt driveway, bouncing and bumping their way down into the woods until an old farmhouse came into view. Despite its age, the house was in really good shape, but there wasn't much to look at in the way of stuff to buy. "I think we made a wrong turn?" Mark asked. "Nah, this is what the GPS said," David replied. "Well, it's been wrong before. Remember Statesville?" Mark said with a grin. Please, don't ever mention Statesville again," David groaned, figuring it wouldn't hurt to give a knock and see if they were in the right place. The brothers got out of the box truck and made their way up the steps. An older man met them at the door, shotgun cradled in the crook of his arm. "Can I help you, boys?" he asked through the screen door. "Are you Gerald?" David asked. "I am," Gerald responded. "I'm Mark and David. My buddy Steve told me that you had some stuff you're willing to part with," David replied and motioned to his older brother and himself as he gave the introduction. After pleasantries were done, it was agreed that the boys would check out his collection of oddities, and the three made their way around the house to the backyard. Like the front yard, the back was loaded with goodies. It was neatly laid out in rows of signs, cars, and motorcycles, as well as parts for both. One shed was floor to ceiling with vintage farming equipment and bicycles, while another was chock full of jugs, bottles, cans, and crates. It truly was a treasure trove of cool stuff in the brothers' eyes. Gerald was willing to negotiate on some things, not so much on others. One thing he never gave up or put down was a double-barrel scattergun. It wasn't too unusual to be confronted with a gun on arrival, but never had they had an armed escort around the property. They tried not to pay too much attention to it, with the progress they were making in filling their truck. And stepping around the last building, on the off chance there was something behind it, Mark froze and stared in confusion at a group of 6 stone statues standing in a circle. He made his way over to examine them, since he had a line on a woman that was looking for lawn and garden ornaments. Each statue was posed differently, and none of them looked the same other than the type of stone they were made of. The details of their faces, hands, and clothes were immaculate. In all, they were 4 that looked like men and 2 that resembled women. 3 of the men had beards, while the 4th only sported a mustache. Yet all of them, male and female, had long hair. They appeared to be from the Middle Ages and simply dressed. Mark had seen many statues from this era, but none so well done of what would have been commoners. He raised a brow and he noticed that they were each wrapped and linked together in chains. On closer inspection, he noted that the chain was iron, crusted over with some type of crystal. Rubbing his finger across the link, he smelled the substance that came off. Salt? What the fuck? He started to mutter, but was interrupted. "What you doing back here?" Gerald called, making Mark jump out of his skin. "Jesus Christ, Gerald, you scared the hell." He started, but was cut off again. "Get away from there," Gerald yelled, cocking the hammers on the gun but keeping the barrel pointed at the ground. "Whoa, don't shoot," Mark said, stumbling over his own feet and falling down. And Gerald's eyes were locked onto the statues, not the man that was crawling on the ground. David came charging around the corner after hearing his brother's words. "What the hell are you doing, old man?" David yelled, only to find the muzzle of the shotgun pointed in his face. "Whoa, whoa," he said with his hands up. The gun quickly swung back around in the direction of the statues. "You boys best be packing it in and heading on out," Gerald said, waiting for them to get moving back around the building before backing away and following them. "Oh, that was intense. What's up with those chains?" Mark said in a low voice. No telling with that crazy old coot," David replied. They started holding their finds back to the truck, quietly chatting about what Mark had found. "So, they're valuable?" David sneered. Maybe, but not worth getting shot over," Mark replied. David only rolled his eyes. With everything just about packed up, they got out their lists and started tallying up what they owed Gerald. "I'll write up a receipt," the old man offered. "That's not necessary," Mark replied. "I insist. Mostly for my records," Gerald said and started for the house. "Go with him. I'll make sure everything is tied down and get the truck started," David told his brother, who nodded and followed the old man inside. As soon as the door closed, David grabbed a pair of bolt cutters and a hand cart and headed back into the stacks for one last prize. He returned to the truck and loaded his pilfered goods as far as he could. He started to go back for another trip, but his brother and Gerald exited the house with only Mark coming down the steps, a slip of white paper in hand. Settled in with what they had, David locked up and got into the cab with Mark, and the two set out on their way back to their shop. And the two got a bite to eat on the way and discussed what they had and who they thought they could get the best price from. The various collectors in their Rolodexes had different tastes and depths of pockets. Phone calls were made as they drove, and by the time they were back home, half the stuff they'd bought was already sold and needed to be shipped. However, it was a long trip and it was late by the time they got back, so it was decided that they would unload their products the next day. David hung around a little while after Mark had left, taking the chance to retrieve and hide what he had stolen. Untying the statue, he shifted it onto the handcart and wooded off the truck. The warehouse they owned was quite large and full of things they had found over the years. With high ceilings and hundreds of lights, maintaining lighting wasn't easy. At some point, they mostly gave up on changing the bulbs, unless they were having a big show, and the only area that was kept lit was the processing area, the cleaning and repair stations, and, of course, their offices and bathrooms. David brought the statue into one of the cleaning bays and gave it a wash down of dirt, moss, rust and salt. It didn't improve the look much, but at least it was clean now. He left the light on by mistake, but closed the door behind himself as he walked out. He'd have to find a better hiding place tomorrow, but for now, he didn't want to trample water all over the place. He turned off the rest of the lights and headed out, locking up and going home for the night. His plan was to get there early and move it before Mark showed up, even though he hated getting up as early as his brother. Mark was always up before the sun even started to peek over the horizon, and today was no different. He found himself eating breakfast while looking over the manifest of their last haul. They'd spent just over $2,000 but stood to make 6 times that between individual sales and auctions. Not bad for a day's work, he smirked. He left his dishes in the sink, got dressed in jeans and his lucky shirt, grabbed his keys, and headed out of the door. It was a short drive to the warehouse where the parking lot was empty, as usual, flipping the keys over and over in his hand as he walked to the side door, humming the tune of a song he'd heard on the radio. Unlocking the door, Mark stepped inside and strode across the room to the main switchboard. The few lights in the storage area were just enough for him to see how to get there without tripping over anything. At about halfway across the room, he noticed a light shining under the door to one of the cleaning rooms. Odd, he said, raising a brow. Quickly and quietly, he went to his office and retrieved his pistol from the locked drawer and then returned to the main area. If there's someone in there, you better announce yourself, he said, pointing the gun at the door. A few slow and quiet steps later, and his free hand, it was on the handle. Mark took a deep breath, turned the knob and swung the door open. He was met by a figure in the light with the hand pointing in his direction. In that split second, he thought he saw a weapon and squeezed off 2 rounds while ducking to the side. Mark didn't hear any return fire or, well, his ears were ringing after firing his pistol inside a giant echo chamber. He pressed a hand to the side of his head as if closing his ears would make the ringing stop. He approached the door again, and the person was still standing there. It took a long moment for him to realize that the person in the room was a statue. Oh, thank God. He let out a sigh of relief and started laughing to himself. Wow, that was great. He froze and stared at the statue. What the fuck? He muttered and took a closer look. Upon realizing that this was one of the statues from Gerald's yard, Mark got on the phone to call his brother. I went straight to voicemail, and from the moment it beeped to the time the recorder ran out, he shouted a multitude of obscenities. Mixed in with the cursing was the message that David had better get his ass to the warehouse ASAP. This had to be the dumbest thing he'd ever done. And Mark, he was furious. An hour passed with no word from his brother. This gave Mark time to think about the situation. If he calls the cops, his brother goes to jail. If they returned it, one or both of them might go to jail. Either way, if word got out that David stole merchandise, or they were finished in the picking community. That left them with 2 options. Sell it or just get rid of it, and Mark was not going to let his brother profit from stolen goods. Picking up a crowbar, he headed back to the cleaning room intending to bash the figure to pieces. Standing before the statue, he raised the weapon above his head. Yet, he couldn't do it. The craftsmanship was just too great for him to just destroy. For him to destroy. This is David's mess. He should be the one to clean it up, Mark thought to himself. He knew their former cop father would be disappointed that one son was a thief and the other was going to help cover it up. But he couldn't let one stupid decision destroy all that he had worked to build. So, turning to leave the room, he reached over and flipped the switch off. As soon as the room was bathed in darkness, something cold and hard grabbed him, yanking him into the room with such force that the crowbar was sent flying. His muffled screams, breaking bones and ripping flesh, would echo throughout the building, but was heard by no one. And soon the building was silent once more, except for the light pattering of blood dripping on the cement floor and clacking of stone footsteps wandering the darkness. David opened a heavy eye and looked at the clock on the nightstand. It flashed 12 o'clock over and over. Picking up his phone, he saw that it was dead, making him groan and plug it in. A moment later, he saw the time was 3 in the afternoon and nearly fell out of bed. Shit! He exclaimed as he tried to get dressed in whatever he could find. In the car, he plugged the phone in again to keep charging while he checked his voicemail. The message left by his brother confirmed that he was too late and the statue had been discovered. Damn it! He yelled, pounding on the steering wheel. The whole drive over, he tried to come up with some excuse, some reason that they should keep the statue. In his eyes, it could be worth thousands, and it will be all profit. He slowed to a crawl when he saw the flashing blue and red lights ahead, surrounding the main entrance to the warehouse. That rat bastard knocked on me, he said, but noticed there was an ambulance. Suddenly, he realized that wasn't the case, and his brother, he might be hurt. He lit the gas and sped into the parking lot, cleared the car and was in the building before anyone could stop him. The big garage doors were open, flooding the processing area with light. The door to the cleaning room was also open, and there was blood everywhere. Marcus! he called as he tried to enter the room to find his younger brother. Officers pulled him away so he couldn't contaminate the crime scene, though he did put up a fight. That is until a CSI tech stepped out of the room and with the tattered and bloody remains of his brother's lucky shirt in an evidence bag. Confirming the worst. "No! Oh God, no! Please, no!" he screamed, crumpling to the floor and began bawling his eyes out. He was so distraught that he had to be carried away from the scene and treated for shock. In the coming months, David was rarely without the bottle in his hand. He quit shaving and would go days without a shower. To put it lightly, he looked like hell had chewed him up and spat him out. There were days where he'd remain sober enough to follow up with the investigation, but the colder the case got, the fewer and farther between those stents got. His personal hygiene wasn't the only thing that faltered. The business that he and his brother had built was close to being seized by the bank due to non-payment on the loan he'd taken out against it without telling Mark. This only drove him to drink more, as he couldn't bring himself to go back to that place. That is until he got totally smashed and found himself kicking in the door. By this point, the property was no longer his, and he was promptly arrested for trespassing and breaking and entering. A few nights in jail sobered him up enough that he thought he remembered seeing something, or rather, not seeing something. "Hey, Sergeant Tilly, mind if I look at the crime scene photos?" he asked. "Won't do you no good, David. Plus, that's against protocol," Tilly replied. Yeah, I know. I think I remember something now. Might help y'all out in finding the son of a bitch that murdered my brother," David insisted, to which Tilly hesitantly agreed. "All right, just don't tell anyone that I let you look at the file." And the file was brought to a conference room where David was waiting with a cup of coffee and some donuts. "Thanks. I'll let you know if I find anything," he said and waved the officer out. At first, it was hard for him to look at the pictures. Seeing the dismembered pieces of Mark's remains scattered about nearly made him lose his breakfast. For hours he combed through the evidence but couldn't figure out what was missing. Mark had fired his gun at least twice, but only one bullet was recovered from the wall in the cleaning room. The pistol was unseen but badly damaged, and so the murderer caught the other slug, but no one turned up with a gunshot wound, and only Mark's blood was found at the scene. What am I missing?" he exclaimed and slammed his fist on the marble table. Like a jolt of electricity, it hit him, and he scoured through the pictures again. In none of the photos or evidence logs was a statue mentioned. He even asked a few of the other officers and techs that were there. Not only had none of them moved it, none of them had seen it or remembered seeing it. When asked more about it, he feigned it as his own mistake and waved it off. The moment he realized the statue was gone, he figured the crazy old man must have taken it and butchered his brother to make a point. Whatever the case, he'd get his revenge. David dug the GPS they'd used on that trip out of a box of things he'd managed to keep before the property was seized, and checked to be sure the address was still in the memory. While he was in luck, and with a newly acquired pump-action shotgun in hand, he got in his car and headed out to the old man's place to confront him about what happened. It was kind of a long drive and gave him time to think about what he was doing or going to do. His initial thought was to kick in the door and shoot the old bastard on sight, but that it didn't seem right. The mixed emotions he had him debating between pushing on or turning around and going home. Remembering the pictures of Mark's body laying in pieces answered the question of what he was going to do. He was going to take Gerald apart piece by piece, just like he did Mark. And put it up to the house. It was just as he had remembered it, and he hated it. In addition to his plan was to burn the house down. Getting out of his pickup, he grabbed the shotgun and made his way up the steps. He swung the screen door open on its creaky hinges and kicked the main door. And taking one step into the house, he saw a flash of a person, the butt of a gun, blinding light with the shock of pain, and then everything went black. Stone Cold Killers. Part 2. Let's get straight into that. David started coming to some time later. His face hurt and his arms and legs were numb. At first he thought he was dead and hell was getting started on his torture. Then a familiar voice brought him out of that idea. "Damn near shot you, boy. The hell are you doing kicking in my door?" Gerald said, sitting in a chair across from David. David realized he was tied to a wooden dining chair, which explained the numbness. Looking up at Gerald, he glared at the old man. "You killed my brother," he said through his teeth. Gerald raised a brow, but otherwise didn't look surprised. "You don't deny it?" David asked. Gerald sat back in his seat and sighed. "In a way, I suppose I did. If I'd done my job right the first time, your brother would still be alive," he said, genuinely looking disheartened. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" David asked, a bit confused. Gerald set his shotgun next to David's and got out of his chair. He walked across the room and took a book off the shelf, and with a pocket knife, he leaned over David's shoulder and placed the blade against his cheek. "Any wrong moves?" And he pressed the blade more to emphasize his point. David nodded, and Gerald cut the cord that secured David's hands to the chair. While David worked to free his hands, Gerald sat back down and placed his shotgun back in his lap and then tossed the book to David. David caught the book and looked at the title. Mythological and supernatural beings and entities. "What the fuck is this?" David asked. "Page 287. Read the first paragraph," Gerald replied. Like a groom at a shotgun wedding, David felt obligated to do as told. He turned into the page and started reading. Chapter 32. The Cursed Stone People of the Middle Ages. It is believed that sometime in the late 13th century, a village was visited by a witch. The witch promised good fortune to anyone that welcomed her into their home for even just one night. Now the village accosted the witch, tying her to a post and stoned her to death. Rather than cry out in pain, she cursed them. For their bloodlust, they shall lust for blood. For the darkness in their hearts, they shall only love the darkness. And for the stones they cast against her, they too shall be cast in stone. Then, as the final rock took her life, the whole town turned to stone. David looked up from the book in total confusion. "I don't understand," he said. "Those statues you boys found, they were the last of the stone people, or stone men, if you prefer. I couldn't bring myself to wipe them out. They were people once and can't help what they do now. I thought if I could help them somehow, or at least keep them from hurting anyone else." Gerald started pouring a glass of single malt scotch for each of them. "I found that iron can damage and ensnare them, while salt is a natural deterrent and dispeller for all things supernatural. Together, they kept them immobile, day or night, until some asshole cut the chains loose," Gerald said, sipping his drink. David picked up the cup, sniffed it, and set it back down. "I'm on the wagon, and it sounds like you need to get on with me," he said, not believing a word of what the old man was saying. "I figured you'd say that," Gerald said, motioning to the television with a remote. He turned it on and hit play. The VCR whirred up and began playing a feed from a security camera. David recognized the face and clothes of the statue that was standing to one side of the edge of the screen, but he didn't recognize its position. "This was in a museum in New York," Gerald informed him. As soon as the lights went out and the camera switched to night vision, the statue, it was gone. "The fuck?" David muttered. The picture changed to a large open room with other artifacts on display. 2 people were walking in this room, one with and one without a flashlight. David deduced that the one with a flashlight was a guard, but who was the other one? The one without was crossing a room towards the guard until the light shone on them, and they froze mid-stride and remained still as the guard approached him. It wasn't until the guard was right in front of the random person that David realized that this wasn't a person, but this statue. The guard turned to shine his light around, but as soon as he did, the statue came to life again, grabbing him up and slamming him to the floor. David watched in shock and horror as the man was beaten, bludgeoned, and torn apart by an animated stone figure. Images of Mark flashed in his mind as he realized that this was the fate of his brother. David's stomach turned, making him retch and fall out of the chair to his knees, and Gerald slid a bucket over just in time as the younger man emptied his stomach. "Yep, I did the same thing on my first time. When I was younger, I hunted these things down, but now I'm pretty much spent," he said, groaning as he flopped down in his chair. David wiped his mouth, returned to his seat, picked up the glass, and downed the contents. After a few minutes and a few more shots, David finally spoke up. Why didn't it move in the lights, and why did it kill the guard?" he asked in a shaky voice. "Well, the rest of the chapter explains that by breaking down the curse. Because they so willingly killed the witch, they're forced to keep killing while trapped inside, with no way to stop themselves. And since they shunned her, they must shun the light, freezing in place when illuminated," Gerald explained. It all came together for David. The box truck had a light on the side. The processing area and cleaning room were lit up, and he'd forgotten to turn off the light before he left. Mark must have turned off the light, but in the end, David was the one that cut the chains and stole the statue. "Oh, it's my fault. My brother is dead, and it's my fault," he said, choking up a bit. And Gerald leaned forward, set his shotgun down on the table in front of David, and said, "That may be, son. The question now is, what are you gonna do about it?" Sergeant Brian Tilley stepped into the room after David left. Everything was scattered about the table, making him sigh in irritation. He straightened everything up and put the file back together so it could go back on the shelf. He was curious as to why David had been asking around about the statue. The description was vague, and as he thought it was strange that David would be asking about merchandise he no longer owned or had access to. "Shit," he said to himself. "Come on, Jones. I think David is going back out to the warehouse," he said, grabbing his coat. Jones, a rookie in training under Tilley, looked up from his report. "But it's the end of my shift and I need to finish." He started but was cut off by his superior. "Now, Jones, you can finish that shit when we get back," Brian yelled, and Jones sprang into action. Tilley flashed a wink and a grin at another sergeant, who chuckled and rolled his eyes. The two arrived at the warehouse just before dusk, but there were no vehicles parked outside. "Doesn't seem like he's here. Should we go back?" Jones asked. That wouldn't be very good police work, now would it? He could have parked elsewhere and walked up, or poured in through the big door," Tilley stated in a matter-of-fact tone, knowing full well he was talking out of his ass. Finding David wasn't the only reason they were there. He wanted to know what was so special about the statue, or if it was even here. He used the key they took from David and opened the door, stepping into the dark space beyond. Jones stepped in as well, and they both turned on their flashlights to see where they were going. Brian went to the switch panel and tried the lights, but nothing worked. "Start checking the stacks while I find the breaker box," Tilley ordered, and off they went. Brian started with the offices and bathrooms, but didn't see anything. In a moment of inspiration, he went back to the switch panel and followed the conduit with his flashlight. I went up the wall and over the offices to a second-floor area. Using the wall-mounted ladder, he went up and saw what he was looking for. And just as he got to the breaker box, he heard Jones scream as something crashed and banged around. "Ah, damn it, Jones. We're here to look around, not trash the place. Whatever you broke, you're buying," he said, but didn't get a response. "Jones," he called out, but again it remained quiet. "Jones, answer me now," he boomed. His echoing voice was the only reply. "Ah, son of a bitch," he grumbled and went back to the breaker box, flipping on all of the switches. Lights came on in sporadic patterns throughout the building. "Jones, if you don't answer me when I find you, I'm going to kick your ass from here to next week," he yelled and started walking down the rows of shelves looking for his trainee. About halfway to the back, he saw a beam of light shining across the floor and went to find its source. Rounding into the divide between racks, he saw Jones' flashlight laying on the floor, in a pool of blood and a hand still attached to it. "Holy fuck!" he exclaimed, drawing his pistol and looking around. "Jones, where are you, son? Are you hurt?" he asked, checking the row the light was on. No Jones. Stepping to the next row, there was more blood, as well as a shoe with part of a leg still attached to it. Tilly put his hand over his mouth, trying not to throw up, and finally he picked up his radio. 1099, officer in need of assistance at D&M's. He called and the dispatcher confirmed the code request and address. Tilly followed the blood trail to an open area off to the side. There he found the rest of Jones. His arms and legs had been either smashed or torn off, and his torso had been ripped open, and his head, it was caved in. There was no holding back the vomit this time as Brian spilled his lunch onto the floor. Looking around, he saw bloody footprints leading away from the scene and around the corner. With his gun up, he gave pursuit, but the trail faded to an end just around the corner. "David, where did you go?" he called out. David, being the killer, was the only logical thing he could think of. He'd been the primary suspect of his brother's death until CCTV put him elsewhere at the time of the murder. Now, Tilly was thinking the timing was off and David had killed his brother as well as Jones. The next aisle was an outside edge on the same wall as the door used to enter the building. He could hear footsteps walking down this aisle, but there was something odd about them. It sounded like whoever it was had bricks tied to their feet. He took a breath and swung around the corner with his pistol aiming at the figure near the end. "Hold it," he called. "Put your hands up," he said, slowly stepping forward. The figure turned around, facing him. It wasn't David. In fact, he didn't recognize them at all from his distance in the dark, but it did look like they were covered in blood. "Hands above your head," he ordered, but they only started advancing on him. "Stop! Stop or I'll shoot!" he called, but they started running at him. "Bam, bam, bam!" He fired, but they kept coming, only pausing with each muzzle flash. "Bam, bam, bam!" Tilly fired again, tripping on his own feet as he stumbled back out of the shadows, hitting his head on a shelf on the way down. This dazed him for a moment, affecting his motor skills as he tried to reload his pistol. He looked up, and there they were, standing just inside the shadows. You're under arrest," he mumbled, trying to lift his weapon again, and then everything went black. David stared at the shotgun before him and then up to the old man. "So, they can be killed?" he asked, and Gerald nodded. "Salt-infused iron buckshot, in a magnum load. Regular bullets chip away at them, but these babies will blast big old chunks out," he said, setting a box of shells on the table. "Where did you get these? How'd you know all this crap?" David asked, standing and pacing the floor. Gerald laughed and said, "I've been doing this most of my life. I've hunted a lot of things that would give you nightmares." What else do I need to know about these stone men?" David asked, sitting back down. "Well, they're damn smart. Been around all these years, standing around watching and learning. They know not to attack groups unless they can split them up. They don't usually work together or coordinate, but they're clever and sneaky as hell. Being made of stone, they're not constricted by lack of strength like we are, and can take a hell of a beating before going down. unless you know what to use, Gerald explained. But their strength is also their weakness. They go stiff in the light, and with the technology what it is today, well, it makes things easier when it comes to trapping them, the old man said with a grin. David still wasn't fully convinced that this wasn't a hoax. The whole thing sounded too fantastic to be real, but what else could have torn Mark apart like that and not left any evidence? I don't know. This just sounds too crazy. I mean, that video, I could have been tampered with, and this book, David said, picking it up. Just a bunch of fairy tales, he said, dropping it back down on the table. Gerald sighed and got up. Come on, I'll prove it, he said, leading David out the back door, shotgun in one hand and a spotlight in the other. They made their way through the rows of junk and around the back of the last shed where the statues had been. When I realized what you'd done, I took care of the rest, except this one. I figured if you came back, you might need a little more convincing, so I left it intact, he said, and pointed to a lone statue standing amid the shattered remains of the others. I was wrapped in chains, which the old man started removing. Help me with this, or let's make a circle around it, he said, to which David reluctantly agreed. They laid the chain on the ground in a ring around 8 feet from the figure in either direction, and then waited for nightfall. It didn't take long, as it was already so late in the day, and with little conversation between the two till then. As the area darkened, Gerald cocked the hammers on his gun and pointed towards the stone man. David watched and waited, but nothing happened. Figured as much. I knew you were yanking my chain, David said, and started to walk away. Gerald stopped him. Step inside the ring. Don't get too close to it. Just step in, he said, and David sighed heavily. Fine, but if nothing happens, he trailed off, leaving the last part to the imagination. Gerald nodded and stepped off to the side, cradling the shotgun and pointing the spotlight at the statue with his finger hovering over the on switch. David rolled his eyes and stepped into the ring, stood there for a moment, and stared at the statue. Nothing happened. He turned towards Gerald in anger. See, I knew it was. As he spoke, he heard 3 thumps on the ground. Gerald flipped on the spotlight, nearly blinding him. What the hell, old man? He yelled and then looked behind him. Holy fucking shit! He exclaimed, stumbling back out of the ring and falling to the ground. The statue was not only in a different pose, but its arms outstretched in mid-stride, but it was also within inches of grabbing him. Now do you believe me? Gerald said, walking over while keeping a light on the statue. David was too stunned to reply, but took the light when it was held out to him and kept it fixed on the figure before him. It stared back at him with an expression of malice and rage. At that moment, he knew that if Gerald hadn't turned on the light, he would have been pulverized by this living work of art. So, first you trap it in the light, and then you simply, Gerald said, placing the barrel of the shotgun against the figure's head and pulling both triggers. Ba-boom! The gun thundered and sent fragments of stone scattering across the clearing, and with the head gone, the rest of the body cracked and crumbled to the ground. David flinched at the sound of the gunshot and stared in awe at the result, but was still speechless. Gerald knelt down and helped David to his feet, leading him back into the house, where he flopped into his chair. I'm too old to be chasing these things down. I got no kin, and by the look of you, you ain't doing too good, as you used to, he said, and set the weapon in the young man's lap. So, if you can clean up the mess you made, I'll let you stay here with me and leave it to you when I pass, he said, and David looked at him, confused. Seriously? You just gonna sign over everything? David asked, and Gerald nodded. Yep. You can keep selling this junk to morons like yourself, or learn the tricks of the trade and hunt the things that go bump in the night, he said with a grin. But David didn't have to think about his answer. Well, why not both? He said, and they shared a laugh and shook on the agreement. Might as well stay tonight. You hungry? I'll put on some soup, Gerald said, getting up and heading to the kitchen. Stone Cold Killers. Part 3. Let's get straight into that. As Brian came to, backup entered the building. Seeing him on the floor, they rushed over to check on him, helping him to his feet. Other than the goose egg on the back of his head and the headache that came with it, he was fine. And that was more than could be said for Jones. Tilly wasn't the only one to lose their last meal at the sight of the rookie's body. Even a seasoned EMS worker couldn't stomach it. After being cleared by a paramedic, Brian started looking around for another body, that of the person he'd shot. In all, he'd fired 7 rounds at point-blank range, and he knew most, if not all of them, had hit the mark. What he found left him in confusion. There was no blood, just dirt, dust, and pieces of flaked rock, as well as bullet fragments. It didn't make any sense. "Did anyone see someone fleeing the scene or walking down the road?" he asked, but everyone responded in a negative. Stepping outside, he looked around at all the blue and red flashing lights, and sitting in his squad car, he thought for a moment. The person he'd seen wasn't David, but at the same time, both murders took place in the same building, and so David had to be connected in some way. He decided to put a APB on him as being wanted for questioning, and then headed back to the station to give his statement and write up the report. David got an early start the next morning, gathering the supplies he would need for the hunt, and loaded his own shotgun with Gerald's iron shot rounds. "I'm going to get going. The sooner I start looking, the sooner this is over," David said, shaking Gerald's hand. "You be careful now and watch your back," Gerald said, pulling from the handshake as he sat back down in his chair. David nodded. "Sure thing," he said, and headed out the door. With everything running through his mind, the drive back didn't seem to take so long. And seeing the police surrounding the warehouse, he'd figured something else must have happened. A lump formed in his throat from the guilt of another death, more blood being on his hands. There wasn't anything he could do about it now, and he sure couldn't pop in for a look around while the cops were there, and so he drove on, heading for town. He wouldn't go too far, though. Once the coast was clear, he'd go back and shoot that evil thing right in the face. Brian had been up the rest of the night giving his account of the incident and filling out the paperwork. His eyes hurt, he was tired, and the goose egg on the back of his head was so tender he couldn't wear his favourite ball cap. He walked down the steps of the police department to his car, idle-mindedly fiddling with the keys. He was very much ready to go home and try and sleep, until he looked up to see David's pickup parked at the diner just up the street. All ailments vanished as Brian made his way over and inside, and seeing David sitting in the corner booth alone and away from the other patrons. He went over and slipped into the seat across from David, glaring at him. "That's not polite to just..." David started but was cut off. "Shut up. Just shut up," Brian ordered in a hushed tone as he could manage. "Someone was in your warehouse last night. They killed Jones and they nearly killed me. Why they didn't do I don't understand, because they had me dead to rights. Now what the hell is going on? Did you piss someone off or something?" Tilly asked, still glaring at David, who didn't look surprised. "Yeah, I saw the crowd out there. I figured something else happened. I'm sorry for your loss of your man," David said, looking down at his cup of coffee. "I'll tell you everything I know, including what killed Officer Jones, but you're not going to believe me," he said, and proceeded to tell Tilly the whole story. He told him about them going to Gerald's yard, him stealing the statue, what the book said, and the video from the museum. He even told him about the old man blowing the head off the last remaining statue, and Brian just sat there and listened to every detail without saying a word. When David was finished, Brian continued to stare at him for a minute before pulling out his phone. "Obviously the loss of your brother has caused you to suffer some kind of mental break. If you let me, I'll get you the help you need. But if you think for a second that I'm going to believe any of that crap, you're crazier than you sound," he said, flipping his phone open. David reached across the table and closed the phone in Brian's hand. Before you ship me off to the nut house, give me a chance to prove it, he requested, and Brian sighed, putting the phone away. Fine, but only so I have more evidence to have you committed, Brian said, and David chuckled. Fair enough. Let's go to the warehouse. There might be clues to back up my story, he suggested, to which Brian reluctantly agreed. David grabbed the duffel bag from the back of his truck and followed Brian to his cruiser. The drive over was awkwardly silent. After the conversation at the diner, idle chit-chat, I just didn't seem to fit the situation. When they arrived, other investigators and lab techs were still there. Brian refused to let David bring his bag inside, since he had an idea of what might be inside. He had a quiet word with one of his fellow officers, and within a few minutes, the building was cleared, except for the two of them. Okay, walk me through it. What happened last night? David said once they were alone. Brian's patience was wearing thin. We came here because I thought you were breaking back in, and I had questions. The lights were off and the switches, they didn't work. I went up to turn on the breakers and sent Jones down the stacks to look around. Then I heard him scream. And Brian paused, clearing his throat. When he screamed, were the lights still off? David asked. Yeah. And then I hit the breaker and I went looking for him. This way. Brian pointed and led the way. I found his flashlight and hand here. The rest was over there. I heard footsteps over here and I went to see who it was. I saw a figure about 5'10", average build, walking towards the door. I told him to freeze, but he turned and then came running at me. I fired and I don't know, 7 or 8 rounds. He stopped, shaking his head. There's no way I missed, but he didn't go down. Hell, he never even flinched. Then I tripped and hit my head. The last thing I saw was him standing over me. David looked at the setup, noting of the claimed 7 to 8 rounds, only 3 were marked off as located. Looking around the floor, he noticed small chunks of stone and tiny bits of unrecovered bullet fragments. Well, you didn't miss, he said, pointing out the evidence. When you fell, you landed here? He asked, motioning to the area. Yeah, your point, Brian replied, still skeptical. You were in the light. I couldn't touch you. Well, it's probably still in here somewhere. If we find it, we can kill it, David suggested. Brian rubbed his temples. He was tired and had had just about enough of this psycho babble, yet something compelled him to give David the benefit of the doubt. Fine, but we're not smashing anything that could be viewed as evidence. If, and that's a big if, you can prove the statue is alive. I'll let you have at it. However, if you're wrong, you have to check into the mental ward for evaluation. Deal? Brian offered, to which David agreed. Joe Tillman was one of the town's many drunks. However, he was the most stable one of the bunch. Between benders, he kept up a small farm and sold fresh eggs and milk to supplement his retirement check. He rolled out of bed and put on his long johns to go fetch the hen's latest batch, as well as milking Betsy. Stepping out onto the porch, he blew out of each nostril and then spat on the ground before taking in the morning air. Looking up the road, he could see the police were back at the warehouse. What are them fruitcakes doing now? He thought to himself. Joe didn't really like the boys that much and hadn't heard about what had just happened to Mark. He figured their lifestyle had finally gotten them into trouble, but it wasn't any of his business. Picking up a pail and a basket, he headed for the barn. Halfway across the yard, he noticed how quiet it was. Far too quiet, considering the number of birds he had. He was concerned that none of the chickens were out pecking the yard, nor could he hear them inside clucking and clacking about. He finished clearing the yard a bit faster and opened the door. Inside there were blood-stained feathers everywhere. "What in the hell?" he muttered. His first thought was a fox had got onto them, but then he looked at the dirt leading to the door, and it was human-shaped feet. He also noticed that no prints were leading out. "All right, you little shit. When I find you, I'm gonna beat your ass black and blue," he said, and then strode on in. The big door remained open to allow in plenty of sunlight for him to see, as he made his way over to Betsy's pen. "You in here with my Betsy?" he asked, looking into her stall. And seeing the twisted mound of gore that was once his beloved cow made him stumble and fall back. What? He muttered, trying to process the gruesome sight. His face scrunched into a scowl of anger as he got to his feet. I'm gonna kill you now, you son of a bitch," he growled, having lost all sense of logic that he couldn't face whatever had torn apart a cow. And striding over to the door and putting it closed, locking it shut with a big iron bar through the handles and frame, and armed with a pitchfork and a little light from the upstairs window, Joe went hunting, jabbing at any mound of hay big enough to hide a person. He stepped onto the second-floor platform of the loft and was hit hard from one side. He flew into the outer wall and was slumped to the floor, gasping for air. His left arm was broken and dangling by his side, and he knew he had some cracked ribs. Looking over to where he'd been knocked away from, a figure was standing in the dark. After a moment, they started walking towards him, giving him little time to get to his feet. He lifted a pitchfork that was still clutched in his right hand and braced it against the wall. The steel prong skipped along the stone surface before catching on a thin crack in the stone, causing them to bend. The handle was grabbed, snapped, and flung away in one motion, leaving Joe staring at the figure in shock and confusion. A pair of rock-hard hands grabbed him up like a ragdoll and began slamming him into the wall and floor. Joe screamed at first, but was soon unconscious and eventually dead. Blood dripped down the walls and ceiling as Joe's limp body was savagely torn to pieces. Before David and Brian could conduct their search, the CSI team needed to finish their job. Both men felt comfortable with letting them back in, but for different reasons. Brian figured it was all in David's head, while David knew the Stone Man wouldn't attack people that were in groups. They waited outside in awkward silence until the last of the techs cleared out and left so they could get started. "You got a shotgun?" David asked. "Why would I need—" "Oh, right," Brian replied, popping the trunk and getting out his police issue Remington 870. David reached into his duffel and pulled out his shotgun as well, and then handed Brian some shells he'd gotten from Gerald. "You'll need these. Solid iron shot," David said, and racked the pump action on his own weapon. Sure. Whatever," Brian said, swapping out his regular shells with the new ones. The two re-entered the building side by side. "So, what are we looking for?" Brian asked. "A statue," David replied. "No shit, Sherlock. What does it look like?" Brian scoffed. "We've had no other statues in storage. Nothing of that size, anyway. So, you'll know it when you see it. If you see it, shoot it," David replied. Without another word, they made their way through the stacks, staying in the light while checking each corner before moving on. They reached the back of the building without seeing it. "Flashlights," David suggested, and Brian nodded. Staying close together, they made sure there was nowhere the statue could hide. It was a long, grueling process, but they cleared the rest of the building without finding a stone figure. "So, are you going to come back quietly or kicking and screaming?" Brian said, clicking the safety on his weapon and then reaching for David's. "You said you were here at night, or maybe it left while you were unconscious," David said, refusing to hand over his weapon. We had an agreement. If we didn't find your statue," Brian was saying, but was interrupted by a distant scream and thudding. They both turned in the direction they thought it came from, seeing a small farm in the distance. "Sounded like it came from old Joe's place," Brian said, clicking the safety back off. "Yeah, let's go check it out," David replied, putting his gun in the back seat of Brian's car, and Brian did the same, and they both got in the front. The drive over was a short one, and the two exited quickly, getting their weapons from the back, just like the storage building. They walked side by side towards the house. Finding it empty, they started for the barn but were unable to open the big door. Brian raised the gun to shoot it open. "Whoa, what if Joe's in there? You might hit him," David pointed out. "Fine. Suggestions?" Brian asked. Hayloft door," David pointed out. Sure enough, on one side of the barn was a ladder leading up to the second-story door. The two of them slipped inside quietly and looked around. It was hard to see in the dark barn, with only a few small specks of light shining in. David turned on his flashlight and shone it around the level they were on and then to the floor below. When the beam passed over a detached human leg, he froze and nudged Brian. Seeing what David was pointing to, Brian's nose scrunched in disgust. Other body parts as well as the dead livestock could be seen strewn about the floor below. "It's here all right," David whispered. Brian wouldn't admit it out loud, but he was starting to believe David's delusions. Motioning to the inside ladder, David moved first, taking slow steps to avoid tripping, and Brian followed close behind, wiping the beads of nervous sweat off his brow with the back of his hand. A loud creak made them both halt in their tracks. David looked back at Brian, who then looked at his own feet, and lifting his left foot, the board underneath let out a slightly softer groan. Brian mouthed a silent, "Sorry," but by then the damage was done. A hand burst through the floor, grabbing his leg. The sound of bones cracking could be heard, causing Brian to scream in agony. His leg disappeared through the hole, followed by the rest of his body, when the old floorboards gave away underneath him. "Brian!" David called, dropping his flashlight in shock of the moment. He jumped through the hole behind his companion, landing hard and rolling to the side. He turned in time to see the statue slinging Brian towards one of the support beams, but swung his shotgun up and fired. The salted iron buckshot pelted the arm of the stone man, blowing it off mid-swing. Brian missed the post, landing in the hay. While he scrambled to his hands and knees and to his 870, and then to his feet to shoot his attacker, but was barely able to stand on his busted leg. And having lost an arm, the stone man turned his attention to David, grabbing his gun and wrenching it to the side, forcing David to fire again. The shot blasted a hole in the roof, casting a beam of sunlight in between them. The stone man had knocked David just away in time to not get caught in the light, backing up and around the sun's rays. Brian waited for a better shot but was distracted by falling debris, covering his head to avoid being knocked out. When he looked up, the statue was on him, punching him in the chest with a loud boom. The steel plates in his vest took most of the blow, but he was sent flying and felt a couple of ribs crack. David was getting to his feet by this point, blood dribbling down his chin. He spat a tooth out while stumbling over next to Brian, helping him up the best he could. The stone man's feet thudded on the floor as it strode across the room towards them. "Come on, Brian, let's fuck this bastard up," he said, racking the action of his shotgun and pointing it at the statue. Brian groaned in pain but managed to get up to a knee. The stone man was almost within arm's reach when they both fired at the same time, followed by sporadic firing when one chambered a fresh round faster than the other. Boom, 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 boom. The statue was blasted back with each shot, losing a leg, its other arm, and massive chunks out of its torso, falling back with a hard thud. And once it was down, they stopped shooting. That and they were out of ammo. David pulled a spare shell from his pocket and loaded it into his gun. And walking over, his face went through all kinds of emotions. Fear at being so close to one of these things. Sadness, which turned to anger at what it had done to his brother. pride in taking it down. Looking down at it, trying to get up, he put his foot on his chest and held it down. This is for Marcus, you evil son of a bitch, he said, bringing up the gun and firing it into its face. The stowman's head shattered from the blast, its body cracking and crumbling under his foot. David spat on the rubble, kicking a few pieces away as he turned to see Brian. "You all right?" he asked, pulling him up to his feet and supporting him on his weak side. "No, I was really looking forward to having you committed," Brian said as they both laughed. It only took a few minutes to think up a clever answer to their injuries. Back at the warehouse, they worked together to turn over one of the tool shelves, causing a domino effect. That hurt more than anything else, David said, digging through what was once valued as treasures. "So, I tripped, turned over a shelf, got busted up a little, but it landed on you. I helped you out from under the mess and called an ambulance. Sound about right?" he asked, to which Brian just nodded. David went out to the car to use the radio to call for help and pulled out his cell to call Gerald with the good news. It rang only a few times before he heard it connect. "Hello?" the old man spoke. "Gerald, I got it. I killed the damn thing," he said with a gleeful excitement. "What'd you say?" Gerald asked. "I said I killed it," David repeated. "It? Don't you mean them?" Gerald asked. "Them?" David inquired. "What do you mean, them?" A confused Gerald came back. You took two of them, didn't you?" Wow. Certainly another one. Wow. Absolutely chest-pounding. What a refreshing storyline there is. Action-packed and a little bit of history and lore there. What a perfect mix to a nightmare-inducing story. Big thank you, James, as always, for your incredible support, brother. Your input is super exciting. I feel very blessed as a narrator to be working with such talents as yourself and Michael G. Lockhart, Edward Ed Smith, and of course, my good friend Wayne Harbison. Cannot wait to see what you write next, and I know you mentioned you have 3 or 4 bubbling in the works at the moment. Well, guys and girls, as ever, you know the drill. Please do let me know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. If you're an aspiring writer or would just like to have a crack at things like myself, then please do get in touch with me at the usual email as on screen, which is dmtforestofear@gmail.com. I really look forward to hearing from you. I hope everybody's had a great week at work, school, studying, or maybe you're a long-distance driver and you just keep hauling on. Whatever it is that you do, I hope you're enjoying it and you're keeping fit and focused. But above all, guys, remember, be safe, not sorry.